This was probably my most contested placement in my last tier list, and it's gonna be my most again. Guys, I don't think Ganyu's that great. I think this character has to be the biggest glow up of all time. Who is number 6? People are gonna be mad. It's Xingqiu. For every Genshin Impact region, we get brand new shakeups to the meta, fun and unique playstyles, and of course, new fan favorite characters. Fontaine has been no exception, and my previous tier list is completely outdated. Welcome to Jello Impact, where we build and test every single character to help you decide who you want to wish for and build. This aims as best as I can to talk about the power of each individual character, such as, yes, how valuable are they to an overall account, but also how strong they perform when given their optimal team, as well as how much they contribute to that team. It does consider the fact that other characters do exist, so if they're completely outclassed, that will probably make them lower. However, I do consider each character in a vacuum as well, because not everyone is looking to just optimize their account. They're looking to see, hey, if I invest in Heizo, if he's my very favorite character, will he perform well? Will he perform poorly? Yeah, he's always going to be a downgrade to either Sucrose or Wanderer, but that doesn't mean he's like bottom tier just because he's strictly worse. I still want to know how solid of a pick he is. I've got the overall power has gone up a lot. I would call tier 3 solid units now. Tier 2 I'll call very good. Tier 4 being underperforming. I do want to also mention that the tier list is in no way shaming you for using lower tier characters. I use Dehya all the time. The reason why I make tier lists is because I think they're fun. I think it's fun to rank characters. Part of the joy that this game brings me is that there is such a diverse cast and so many combinations to try out and so many variables to discuss. A lot of people will say tier lists are useless because there's so many variables, and to me that's part of the fun, is weighing all the different variables, enemies, different boss types, different mechanics, synergies, the fact that it is a team game and not just a single unit game. It makes tier lists a very nuanced and very complex discussion, and although at the end we will get this definitive tier list ranking, and I have thought a lot about it, I put a ton of time and work into my tier list, making sure I have the best opinion I can form. I've talked to quite a number, half a dozen theory crafters, very prominent faces in the community, and gotten their thoughts on my tier list. And of course, we don't agree on every single placement, but just so you know, this is a very well researched and very well tested tier list. But at the end of the day, it is still an opinion. And my goal as we go through is not only to tell you why the characters go in each spot, but to give you pros and cons and some tips on how to get the most out of each character if they're your favorite. And hopefully, if you're new, you can look at this list and say, okay, I can aim to get all the broken characters, and then I'll pick my very favorites out of tier 1, tier 2, and I'll know that if I do pick up a tier 3 or tier 4 unit, that I might have to work a little bit harder or use them in more of a niche way to get them going. We'll consider 5 stars at Constellation 0 with 4-star weapons, but I will talk about the impact of 5-star weapons on them and early constellations. I also will be considering 4 stars at Constellation 6 for their final ranking, but I will talk about if you do not have Constellation 6, if you have like Constellation 2 or something, I'll talk about where I think that they would go. And I understand that Constellation 6 is very difficult to achieve for new players, but keep in mind that a lot of times the C6 doesn't totally change their ranking. There's only a few characters that really get made or broken by their C6. Starting with last place, Aloy suffers from having a 4-star stat line, even though she is listed as a 5-star. She has a lot of gameplay issues. She doesn't have any constellations, and she also suffers from Cryo having become a worse element and getting new options for Cryo since she came out with Charlotte and Layla and Wriothesley. So overall, just really in a rough place. If you want to use her though, I can recommend Freeze or Mono Cryo. Probably, to be honest, Hyper Fridge might actually be your best bet. She's not completely garbage. She can hit some pretty decent numbers with her Cryo infused normal attacks, but tons of gameplay issues and just a low power ceiling, lack of constellations, lack of synergies, just being generally outclassed really holds her back. Electro Traveler. I only ranked the highest Traveler before, but this time, since I've actually tested all the other variations factions of the Traveler, I wanted to weigh in on them as well. Hydro Traveler, it's impressive that they could make a Hydro unit this bad. His burst goes through enemies regardless of what they are, so you have no off-field Hydro application. Even though it has okay scaling, the fact that it literally can't hit enemies for its whole duration means that in practice it ends up being garbage. His skill stands him in one place and has really poor Hydro application and very poor damage. If you do want to use him, Geo Traveler actually has a bit of new life with Navia. He gives a bit of a crit rate buff, some off-field Geo damage. Overall, the damage is unfortunately pretty underwhelming, and if you have a better Geo option for your Navia, you're definitely going to want to do that. Not a horrible unit by any means, but it's just like, just does damage, little bit of a crit rate buff. If they were as good as they were with Navia with other characters as well, I think you could justify a tier 3 placement, but because it's just Navia, like if you have a Navia and you don't have a Zhongli or Albedo, for example, I think that you could consider them a tier 3 character. But because if you really love Navia, you're probably going to go for them, or there's going to be a new Geo character that comes out that's going to be her second Geo. I think tier 4 is the least misleading place for me to put Geo Traveler, but you can definitely make them work if you want. I think Electro Traveler's best use is either a Hyper Bloom or a Burgeon trigger. You can kind of do the same thing as you do with EM Razor or Cyno, and they give themselves an Electro infusion sometimes, and if not, you can stand in Bennett Circle and get a Power infusion for Burgeons. If you want to learn about that playstyle, check out my Razor video on my channel. You basically build them the same way. The problem is the range is not very good. Standing in Bennett Circle is not very good. You're basically just having an on-field Electro character that contributes nothing except for Electro elemental application, and they're just being carried by their teammates. It's a team that can work, but it's not very fun to play. It's not very satisfying. Their kit is very clunky. I did test it and I did not enjoy it. Technically, still cleared the Abyss. Amber mains are the craziest, most dedicated people in the world. Even with main DPS Amber, you can melt her hits, melt her Baron Bunny just by abusing really intricate knowledge of game mechanics. You can do some really sick stuff with Amber. Just Google Amber clears Abyss and there's some really impressive stuff there. The average person though is not going to be getting anywhere near that. And it's definitely something, not only do you have to learn a lot to do, but also invest heavily to make sure her investment is high enough. For most players, her only niche will be as a support for Hu Tao, providing elemental application, using the instructor's artifact set to buff, using the elegy for the end bow if you have it to buff Hu Tao's elemental mastery and attack. If she came with elegy for the end bow, you know, you could put her here, but since you have to specifically wish for the elegy for the end bow to make her even get there, it's kind of tough to justify her being anywhere except for tier 4. Plus the fact that Hu Tao just have so many more better options these days and easier to pull off options, and it's a glass cannon team when you're using Amber, and the Abyss has gotten more aggressive recently. Next is Kaveh. Still one of the most disappointing characters for me personally, leveling him all the way up to 90 and having his unique mechanics that burst the cores, sort of like a budget Nilou. Unfortunately, he ends up just performing subpar. He had a kit that really could have incentivized being used with Farina if you didn't have to build full elemental mastery for him to maximize exploding the blooms. Plus, he just has anti-synergy. You usually want the Hydro character to explode the blooms on Nilou teams. Not that he can't slap on Nilou teams or on Hyper Bloom teams. It's just that he's never the best option. He can be a comfy option for Nilou teams, so I'll give you that. If you love Kaveh and you want to see him do stuff, you know, Nilou all the way. But I just feel like his kit is just so jumbled and incohesive and just weak, unfortunately. Just what he actually brings to the table. It's not that the teams can't perform. It's just that he specifically doesn't do very much for those teams. Jin Yan, she's one of the few characters that I haven't fully built and tested yet. I have about 7 characters to go until I've built and tested them all. Basically, she just performs worse. There's so many on-field pyro DPSs and she's just the worst of them all. Her split scaling of shielding being based on defense and her actual damage being based on attack. She absolutely needs C6 Bennett and Xiangling and Kazuha to even function as a carry. She doesn't function in Virgin, and as a shielder, she's fully outclassed by by multiple units in the game. So overall, definitely an underperforming unit. That being said, if you do have C6 Bennett, if you do run on a mono power team, she can absolutely still full star the Abyss to this day. If you love her, you can definitely still use her. Next is going to be Ning Wang. She works fine as a 4th slot for Navia teams. As a DPS herself, she's very clunky, very hard to use, honestly, properly. Performs very poorly. The Geo element really holds her back. She did get a buff from the new artifact set, so if you go ham and you really farm out that artifact set, I think there's a case to be made. Maybe she really does belong in tier 3. So if you want to put her up here, it's like, I do think she is a step above most of the characters in tier 4, but I also think she's a step behind the characters that are going to be in tier 3. So I'm going to leave her here for now, but maybe we'll readjust at the end. Next is going to be Mona, one of the characters that I still have not lost the 50-50 to, very sadly. She is now what I would consider the worst standard banner 5-star, because while other characters like Jean and even Chi-Chi have been raised up in value because of Furina basically replaced Mona in the only niche that she had. And even then she was already mostly a downgrade to Kokomi. I think that Mona is still fine on freeze teams with Ayaka and Ganyu, and still a pretty decent option. Like I said, I think tier 3, these are still solid units. Like, these are still decent characters. It's just that the overall power level of the game has gone up, and the amount of play styles and things that each unit can do has gone up a fair bit, and Mona just hasn't kept up with the new trends. She doesn't work with Hyper Bloom, she doesn't work with Furina really, and just better and better Hydra units just keep coming out. And Mona still has some good stuff. She still has good buffing, but her best thing was Freeze, and Freeze is sort of the worst thing Hydra was doing lately, but still not a bad character. Next is going to be Chi-Chi. And with Furina, Chi-Chi can kind of do some stuff. You can be an on-fielder. You can build her for physical damage, use Aquila Favonia and use physical damage normal attacks. And that buff from Furina, not only does the buff, this is the cool thing, is if you want, you can actually build a hybrid physical cryo build. Not necessarily for Chi-Chi, because she doesn't do all that much cryo damage, but you could build attack percent goblet. And so if you're using a hybrid physical elemental character, Furina's all-type damage bonus buff will work both for physical and for elemental. But anyways, Chi-Chi's best use right now is as an on-fielder for Furina teams, and you can use 3 offensive characters, something like Furina, Yelan, Kazuha, and you're gonna get a bit of freeze, which is really nice for crowd control, and just that broken double hydro core with Kazuha to shred resistances. You know, you can use her with Hyper Bloom. She would be higher, but her elemental application is very low. She doesn't have any form of buffing, and even her off-field healing has a lot of downtime, pretty inconsistent, and it's not really a team-wide heal, so it doesn't work amazingly with Furina. But again, if you have her on field, then she does have that spot. Next is going to be Fremine, another character that I haven't fully built up, mostly because I don't have his C6 or anywhere near it yet. I've heard some people say that he reaches Eula's level, and from the numbers I've seen, he doesn't quite. From what I've heard people say, it's mostly people just really want to hate on Eula. I think the biggest thing going for Fremine is how well he synergizes with Hyper Bloom, and the biggest downside for Fremine is how much better other characters synergize with Hyper Bloom. So although he can get his shatters, and although he does get some nice buffs from using Furina Hyper Bloom that boosts his personal damage on those teams, he doesn't contribute a crazy amount, but the teams overall perform very well. I have 36 star the Abyss with my level 1 Fremine, so just imagine if you actually build him. I think the biggest thing that I don't like about him is how his teams are mostly single target, but his shatter passive requires shattering, which is inherently not a boss mechanic because bosses can't be frozen to shatter. So overall, sadly, an under-designed kit, and I really hope it means we get physical buffing characters in the future. I think it's coming. Wait for it. I think Anemo MC is actually pretty solid. This is one of those characters in a vacuum. You might even be able to get away with rating Anemo MC up here, but I think Anemo overall is less necessary than it used to be, and there's more and more free-to-play options for Anemo, like Lynette. I think the burst is really annoying, but you know, having VV, having Anemo, Shred, all-type elemental shred, further shredding on top of VV is nice. But these days, yes, you use Anemo for the VV, but to really truly justify an Anemo on your team, most of the time you want them for something else as well, whether it's Kazuha's elemental damage buff and grouping, Sucrose's EM buff and grouping, Venti's grouping. You're looking for something in addition to just that VV. Otherwise, you might just play double Hydra, you might just play Hyper Bloom, you might just play something that doesn't even require VV. So I think that the ask for Anemo these days is higher than it used to be, but Anemo Seep's still pretty decent if you want to run them. Next is Diona. People got super mad at me for underrating Diona, and now I'm bringing them even lower, which you might think is very surprising because, hey, with Dendro, you know, her elemental mastery buff is more valuable, and with Fontaine, you know, healing is more valuable for Furina. The problem is, this elemental mastery buff that she gives, you don't really run. It only gives elemental mastery to the active character, first of all, and the character that really wants the elemental mastery is usually not even on field, and you don't really want to be running a cryo character, especially a cryo healer, on Dendro teams. You normally want it to be Kuki or your Dendro unit to be your healer because Dendro is the more valuable element. So wasting your cryo slot for healing, really not a good idea. She's not best in slot on any teams anymore. Again, tier 3, still, these are solid units, so it's not like I think she's awful. It's just that versus other characters, versus Layla, versus Charlotte, that's the next part, right, is Furina really wants a full party healer. Diona can only heal one at a time, and her healing ticks are pretty slow, her shield is pretty weak, the elemental mastery buffing is useless for most of the teams that you actually want to use her on. The only time I can actually see it being useful is on Ayaka freeze team where you're using Kazuha, or a mono cryo team. She buffs Kazuha's elemental mastery, making his damage bonus slightly bigger. But yeah, she's okay. She's still fine, right? Like, again, tier 3 still solid units, but definitely not one that I would recommend you build it unless you just like her. Next is gonna be Diluc, and I'm about to eat my words because there's gonna be a character in the next patch that puts him higher. I guarantee he's like here or something after the next patch. We won't talk about why, we won't talk about what character, but I know I'm gonna eat my words. I know he's gonna be higher. The character's not out yet though. We'll have to wait until the end of Fontaine where I do my next tier list, you know, 6 months or 7 months from now or whatever it ends up being, that Diluc will finally get his retribution. But for now, he still sits in tier 3. I don't think he's awful. If you really love Diluc, I will say this, if you really love Diluc, I've seen some clears that do put him here. I've seen some very impressive melt Diluc clears. Just go look it up. They're amazing. Blow my mind. But they're very hard to replicate. It requires a ton of game knowledge and skill, sort of like the Amber Melt stuff. If you love Diluc, you can make him here. But since it's not practical for most people, I'm gonna put him here. But I'm really excited for next patch where we get a character that's gonna make him actually good. I'm stoked for it. And next is gonna be Dehya. Now, despite moving down in the placements, objectively she's gotten a lot better. I probably overrated her a bit, and also just the overall power of tier 3 has gone up because of Furina. It's really Dehya's place in Neuvillette and Lyney teams that warrant her being here. She's a solid unit, which is exactly what tier 3 is. I use her as a carry. As a carry, she's more over here. But on Neuvillette teams, they're definitely her best teams for that interruption resistance, for providing that pyro application, providing some occasional vapes. Her place on his Hyper Bloom teams, on that kind of burning-ish stuff, they're actually excellent teams, like really excellent teams. I would just say that her contribution to those teams is not like super high, but Dehya mains, you know, rejoice that she at least is a really good support on those teams. If there's more characters that can use her like Lyney and Neuvillette do, I could even see her moving up to here because supports are valuable. So time will tell whether she's like a somewhat niche support for these two characters or whether her stocks will rise in the future. Next is going to be Yunjin, moving down quite a bit. I had her in tier 2 because she was sort of a best in slot support for Yoimiya at the time. Nowadays with Furina, Yoimiya has new best teams, and yes, she is comfortable in double Geo along with Zhongli for Yoimiya, so it's a good comfort team. Arguably better than double Hydro with Yoimiya and Zhongli, double Hydro, double Geo. Double Hydro, single Geo, sorry. The fact that she's no longer best in slot, she only works really with 3 characters like Wander, Ayato, Yoimiya. She's really not best in slot for Wander or Ayato, not even close. And overall, she requires a lot of investment. But that being said, you know, if you do have Wander, if you do have Ayato, if you do have Yoimiya, she is fun. I like her a lot. I think she's a solid unit. I've cleared the Abyss with all 3 of these characters using Yunjin, and I enjoy it. I think once you actually get her built, once you get her up and running, it's like, awesome, this team feels good. The problem is, why would I build a Yunjin when the off-field DPS options are just so much better? So Yunjin, solid unit, but not really anything to write home about. I actually think I'm going to put her behind Dehya. I think I might move Dehya up a little bit, actually, thinking about it more. I'm actually going to put her at the top of tier 3 for now, just because of how good she is on that Neuvillette team. I really like Sayu. I tested her a lot with Farina doing Sayu National. It was so fun and it was so good. Really solid unit. Has to be on field, doesn't have grouping, so her healing is nowhere near that of Jean, so using her as an off-field healer in VV Shredder is not nearly as good as it was with Jean. But Sayu National with Farina is awesome. Sayu Taser with Farina, Sayu Hyper Bloom, Quick Bloom with Farina. On-field Sayu with Farina is sick. Highly recommend doing it if you love Sayu. The teams aren't meta, there's way better options, but really, really fun. It's just made, I mean, if she also worked as an off-field healer for Farina, then it would be easy tier 2 or even tier 1, but having to be on-field really limits what you can overall do, but still really, really fun and really, really good. Next is Kujou Sara. I'm very sad to say that even before I was able to get my C6 Kujou Sara, she has been power crept to oblivion. She is no longer part of anyone's best team, no longer part of Raiden's best team, not at C0, not at C2, not with or without Engulfing Lightning. Farina has just completely power crept Kujou Sara, which is too bad. I wish, it almost feels like that they didn't allow Raiden to work with Beidou because they wanted Kujou Sara to be the best in slot support, and then they did, but what they should have done is just made Kujou Sara better. Let her work with Beidou, and then just made Kujou Sara a better character. But not only is she not the highest damage option and not highest DPS option for Hyper Raiden anymore, but she's also very clunky to use because other options with Raiden provide much more flexibility for rotations and multi-wave content. Kujou Sara makes it so you have a very big front load, which is nice, but if you ever need to do damage to multi-waves or multiple phases of a boss, it just becomes much clunkier. The opportunity for overkill is much higher. The flexibility is lower for the team as to what enemies they can face properly. Still strong for Raiden in particular, and only at C6. If you have her below C6, she's over here. So yeah, and maybe not even here. Maybe she's like down here. So I will still be building her up quite a bit for screenshot damage for Raiden. I'm still pretty excited to get her C6 into player, but she's definitely fallen off as a top tier Electro support. And her short duration really limits her synergies. Yeah, even Yae Miko, Cyno, like anyone else, she just doesn't have synergy with. She kind of works with Kaching. But the other problem, obviously, is that Fischl is just generally way better. Beidou is better, even Lisa is better a lot of the time, so sad but true. Next is gonna be Dori. Dori got pretty big glow up from Farina, using her as like a budget Cyno. Farina, she's actually pretty solid. Next is Lynette, our resident free-to-play Anemo option. Basically, it's her lack of grouping that holds her back. Similar issues to the Anemo MC. Her best use is on a Wanderer or just any sort of Farazan team where you have C6 Farazan. You can use her on field as a driver at C6, but you kind of need her, you really need her C6 to make that work. She's good, she's solid. Anemo is a good element, but again, these days you need more than just a good element to be above. That makes her solid, right? She's a solid unit. Next, we have Barbara. Barbara's best use is still on a Nilou team where she could build EM and still heal enough, especially with sac frags and from her burst. Still one of Nilou's better options, especially for free-to-plays. Unfortunately, her synergy with Farina is very limited because unlike Kokomi, she can't do damage and do big heals at the same time. If you want to do damage, you need to do attack. If you want to do healing, you need to build HP. So overall, she doesn't get the hugest power jump, but she's still a solid character, so still tier 3. Next is going to be Dendro main character. Providing Dendro is still valuable, but these days, at least for me, it's not enough to get you into the very good unit spot. It's only enough to get you into a solid unit spot. Still solid in Hyper Bloom, still solid in Burgeon, still solid in all those other things, but there's just so many other units that do better things. Despite me putting them right beside each other, I do substantially like Kale better than Dendro main character. The thing that impressed me most about Kale, I didn't end up releasing my Kale guide because I got busy doing other things, but I did test her out a lot, and I was really impressed by how well she worked as a Nahida replacement as a Hyper Bloom driver at C6, and with her buff buffs, with everything going on. She's actually a really good unit and applies a lot of Dendro. You can use her with Sacrificial Bow as a free-to-play, or Elegy for the End if you've got some 5-star weapons. I'm actually going to move her up higher up, closer to where Dehya is going to be at the top of tier 3, because I actually think that Kale is a pretty underrated and pretty good unit, actually, especially when you get those higher constellations, which you don't need. You can still build her up at C0. She also is arguably the ceiling option still to this day for Nilou Bloom teams. I tend to choose Baizhu for a more comfy option. I think Kale is a character that you could even make a case for being in tier 2, but before I put her up there, I'm gonna do a lot more testing with her and just make sure that it's not just my own hype. But I think that tier 3, at the top of tier 3, is very respectable place for Kale and very fair. Next is gonna be Candace. I definitely think I overrated Candace on my last tier list. I think it was just more overcompensating for the fact that people thought she was so bad, but I think she's a solid unit. She is a solid free-to-play Hydra, especially when you get high constellations, if you happen to get them. I recently got C6, so I'm excited to try her out and see if that changes my opinion. But I think, as long as you have C1, she is definitely a tier 3 character. She's definitely carried by Nilou, but she is good on Nilou teams. She's very good, and I think she is solid on other teams that need Hydro. But he's obviously going to be outclassed every time by Xingqiu, Yelan. But those are the best characters in the game, so I think tier 3 is very solid and very fair. Next is a triple whammy of Chongyun, Kaya, and Rosaria. Chongyun's a character that I definitely underrated. If going by my last tier list metrics, he would definitely be in tier 2. As of late, the value of a cryo DPS has gone down a lot, but reverse melt is still excellent. Mono cryo Chongyun is still excellent. If you want to hear my full thoughts on Chongyun, I did a guide very recently on him, and he is awesome to play. His front load is awesome. I definitely think that I really fought hard with myself to not, I really wanted to put these characters in the tier above. It was very hard to separate tier 3 and tier 2, but I think that these characters, they're solid, but they're not very, very good. Kaya here as well basically gives more sustained damage, but lower damage, more energy as a support for someone like Ayaka. Rosaria is kind of the highest damage ceiling out of the 3, definitely the best of the 3, but not by that much. You can kind of build whoever you want. Gives a crit rate buff. Her buff snapshots. Her downside is that her damage is all in one place. If you got really mobile enemies, you can't freeze them, or if they're mobile, you're gonna have a hard time doing all of the damage that she has to offer. Next is gonna be Razor. I think his Burgeon team is still really good. Again, check out my Razor video if you want to see more. But it uses Nahida, C6, Bennett, Xingqiu, some of the most high value teams, the characters in the game. I often if I pick that team struggling to pick another team on the other side, you can just make better teams with these units. He's definitely being carried, which is fine. He still does stuff on the team. It's still really cool. It's still pretty good. He's still solid, but he's not really bringing that team up. He's sort of more holding it down. But if you love Razor and you want to use him on field, that team is awesome and super fun. Next is Hazo. Similar to Lynette, similar to Anemo MC. Anemo's a great element. I think him having to be on field, not having a ton of grouping, it just limits his synergies a lot. And he ends up being an on-fielder. He basically becomes the bottleneck for his teams. I think you could make an argument for him being in very good unit as a taser driver or aggravate driver or something like that. I think taser is just pretty good though. I don't think taser is a super insane team. I think there's better things you can be doing as an aggravate driver. I think that his potential as a hyper carry is just limited because of his 4-star scaling. So I think he's solid. I think he's a solid unit. I think this is where he belongs. And then obviously we already put moved Kale up. We've got Dehya here, and then top of the tier is going to be Layla. I think that it's really tough. A lot of these characters, Layla, basically in the same thing as Dehya, is that on Neuvillette teams, she feels amazing on Neuvillette teams. The resistance to interruption that she provides, the extra frozen reaction, she's pretty good on Wanderer teams as well, if you can get that cryo infusion consistently, which I've had a bit of trouble doing, but if you can get it. She also provides that normal and charge attack buff at C4. She's really good on mono cryo. She gives a lot of damage. I could easily see Layla and maybe Dehya, maybe Kale. These are characters that are kind of flirting with the edge of being part of tier 2. I'm going to leave them at the top of tier 3, but just know that I do think very highly of these characters. It's just that I guess it's kind of niche. Their performance versus other options is either only very nichely better or slightly worse, but I think that these are very, very solid characters. And, obviously the lower ones are just solid and the higher ones are starting to be really quite good. But Layla's got a great thick shield. She actually does good personal damage, especially if you ever C6. I know mono cryo with Ayaka, Shenhe, Layla, Kazuha is not very popular. I happen to love it, but I'm kind of in the minority there. But I think because of her synergy with Neuvillette, she's still a very solid unit. Moving on to tier 2, we have Mika. Mika is a character that I like a lot more in theory than I like in practice. In theory, he provides great heals, he provides cryo, he provides attack speed. So even if you're not at C6 providing that damage buff for someone like Eula, at least for someone like Wanderer and, you know, on a Farina team, he's providing that healing, some freeze for crowd control utility, some attack speed for Wanderer. Should be quite good. In practice, his healing isn't like insane. He needs a lot of ER and it just feels a little bit scuffed. If we were to go by personal feel, I would rather switch him with Layla, like put him down in tier 3 and put Layla up in tier 2. It also feels a bit, I don't know. I feel like Layla might just deserve to be up here anyways. What the heck? This is my tier list. I think Layla is better than Mika. Even with Farina, sue me, I think that Mika's healing is not quite good enough to be really, really comfortable. But no, I'm gonna try and be unbiased because I think that if you build Mika properly with higher investment and really get those heals going, that he is a good character with Wanderer. But then again, there's the interruption resistance. It's hard. It's really, really hard. Let me know what you think. Eula is next. She definitely is better than she was before with Farina teams, but the teams feel substantially worse than other Farina teams. So although she's in the best spot she's been with, you know, synergy with Mika, with Farina, she really needs that pure, dedicated, physical, you know, off-field damage dealer, support, whatever. I personally still think it's gonna come one day, but it's not here yet. She is definitely my least favorite limited 5-star. Every time I use her, I'm disappointed. I've even crowned her burst. I'm gonna level 90 her. I'm gonna make a whole, I'm gonna try again for Eula, but every time I try and use her, it just feels very lacking. I think that if you invest highly into her, you get her, you know, her good constellations, even just her early ones. She starts to perform a bit better. You hyper min-max into vertical investment, but at that point, you could just be hyper investing into Farina instead. So it's tough. I think next is going to be Goro. Goro and Itto, they have gotten some buffs from Farina. I will say I haven't built Itto yet because I don't have him yet. He hasn't reran since I started my YouTube channel, so I haven't had the opportunity to get him. As soon as he comes out, I'll be min-maxing him. I hear from Itto mains that he's underrated, so maybe it's a case of his numbers not looking that impressive on a sheet, but he actually feels really good to play and he actually does, you know, really consistent clears when you're actually using him. If that's the case, I'll update him by the time we get, surely he'll rerun by the end of Fontaine, so I'll be able to build him and test him out. For now, this is where I have him. I think the biggest thing that holds him back, I didn't really talk about what I dislike about Eula, but it's kind of the same thing for both of them, is they both have decent AoE, which is great. But the problem is neither of them have synergy with Anemo units like Cosmo. And because they don't have synergy with these Anemo units that can group, their AoE often feels very bad because you can't really take advantage of it. If enemies are a bit too spread out, you basically have no AoE. And their damage is sort of based on the fact that they do have pretty solid AoE. So it's like they're AoE characters, but can't use the best AoE characters to actually support them. If Anemo could shred Geo, even just a little bit, even if it was only 20% instead of the whole 40% or something like that, and same with physical, these characters would be way better because you could actually run them with a grouper and not lose a ton of damage. Itto also does have the issue that his teams are very expensive. You want him, you want Itto, you want Goro, you want Zhongli, you want Albedo, and these are characters that you normally don't really want, or at least Albedo and C6 Goro. So I think it might be the case though that dedicated Itto mains, they've gone out and got his weapon. They've gotten maybe his C1 or his C2 going for Goro constellations. And once you get to that point, he's probably a tier 1 character, right? Once you have maybe C2 R1, you know, he's definitely a tier 1 character. So I think it's possible that Itto mains are biased, but I think it's also possible that I just haven't tried him yet. And in practice, he feels better than he looks on the sheets. Because on the sheets, he doesn't look super, super impressive. And Goro, like, basically, yeah, he works with Noelle, but Noelle's best teams aren't with Goro anymore anyways, and so he's basically just an Itto bot. He's still really good, you know, especially since he buffs both Itto and Albedo on that team. Next is Albedo, also hasn't rerun since I started my channel. He's gotten a bit better because he now works with Navia. I still think that Zhongli is the preferred, from what I've seen, Zhongli is still the preferred Geo for that team because of the res shred and interruption resistance. Crystallize just pretty unreliable. But I think if you're able to play perfectly, then Albedo technically is the damage ceiling. So maybe he does belong higher, but for now I'm going to have him here. But I think that it's nice at least that he has another team. I think the biggest problem that holds Albedo back is they just messed up his burst. His burst doesn't really do anything. They really need to rework Crystallize and maybe make it scale better off of Elemental Mastery so that his buff actually means something. I think that'd be a pretty cool thing for them to do. I'd be really happy with that. It's like they buffed Hydro Resonance, like Hydro Resonance of all things, like the most broken element. So surely they can buff Crystallize a little bit, surely. He's also a solid, decent flex pick in just double Geo teams, double Hydro, double Geo. But I think that the double Geo core is just getting used less and less and less as we have more and more good off-field supports, such as Farina, etc. Next is Yanfei. Yanfei is a character that I haven't built up super huge myself, but I played on my friend's account who has a really well-invested Yanfei, and I was very impressed. Her damage was only slightly lower than Yoimiya, but having her own built-in interruption resistance is like super awesome. And even if you don't build enough ER to get, I think that's the biggest thing that holds her back is you need to build a lot of ER to actually get her burst every rotation. But I really like her. I think she's a completely viable option if you want to pyro DPS and you just want to, you don't want to get Hu Tao, or you don't want to build Xiangling or something. You can use her with double Hydro Bennett, with Jean. I wonder if there's even a double swirl setup you could do with Jean and Farina. I haven't seen anyone talk about it, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's out there. You can use her as a shield bot, but I think that there's sort of better options for shields these days. So she's mostly up here just on her merit as a DPS, which is pretty impressive. Keqing was my very first 5-star, and I still like her a lot. As an aggravate driver, quick bloom with Farina. She's generally relegated to being just an on-fielder. But again, these are very good units, right? This tier is very good units. If you want to see my full thoughts on Keqing, check out my Keqing guide. Her ability to be quick swappy, her burst having a super low energy cost and a big AoE means you can spam it very easily and get lots of iframes. In the past, I said that you could use her teams without a healer, and that would sort of bring up the overall power of Keqing teams. Nowadays, the Abyss has been very aggressive, and I think it's pretty much impossible to get away without a defensive option for most people. So I think she's stuck squarely in tier 2. Very good as an aggravate driver, but there's lots of options. And one of the options is a free character you get, Lisa. I made an awesome guide on Lisa that you should definitely check out. It did not do that well, but you all have Lisa. You all should watch that guide. It's really, really good. But the fact that she can be both an on-field aggravate driver as well as an off-field spread support for Alhaitham, who's one of the best, if one of the best carries in the entire game. The Lisa spread teams felt amazing. The Lisa Quick Bloom, Lisa Quicken, her Ascension stat being Elemental Mastery. She's just great. She's a great character, and you get it for free. So the only reason I have her above Keqing is because of her off-field potential to be used with Alhaitham. If rated as both aggravate drivers, I would much prefer Keqing. I just find her playstyle much smoother and easier to use and more iframes, but Lisa is a great option as well, and again, more flexible. Next is going to be Yoimiya. I love Yoimiya. She is my most used character for on-fielders, period, because I never take her off my overworld team. She's incredible. I love her auto-targeting. There's a bunch of things that people underrate with Yoimiya is that her ability to not have to dash to get close to enemies saves her valuable time in the Abyss. So things like the Megukenki dashing around, the Mirror Maiden moving around, any enemies that move, she really saves you time that isn't encapsulated on the sheets. If she had decent, even halfway decent, even slightly passable AoE, I would move her up to tier 1, 100%. But the fact that she's fully single target locked keeps her to tier 2 for me. I think she's very strong. It also doesn't help that her best teams are shielderless teams, which a lot of people don't like. I've gotten used to them now. VV Vape with Yolan Bennett Coswell, I love. Double Hydra with Jean, I love. But unfortunately, that's real single target lock keeps her from being in tier 1. But I do think she has some really solid pros, and I think she's strong enough that she's really, really good. But if there's ever those abysses where it's a mix of single target and AoE, which right now we've had a couple single target straight abysses, which is nice. And I know you can do the reset thing, but I value it when characters can do some AoE, at least enough to be passable. for Chamber 1, for example. Tighnari, another character that is single target locked. However, Tighnari's damage output slightly higher, a bit more quick swappy, really high damage potential overall. But again, pretty much completely single target locked, keeps him locked to tier 2 for me. But very high damage profile though. Very impressive damage. Next is going to be Charlotte. If you've used Charlotte, you know what I mean when I say that her heals are mind-blowing. Your entire team can be in the red, and with just one pop of the burst, they're all up to full. She is the best healer. She's the best at healing in the game. I think I even underrated her in my original assessment of her because I said it's pretty much impossible to use Thrilling Tales, but if you ever C4 and you actually focus on getting ER substats on all your pieces and getting a lot of them, she actually can run Thrilling Tales. And so you can use her on a Navia team. You can use her on a Wanderer team to pass on Thrilling Tales. You can use her on a Eula team, right? If you don't have C6 Mika, that Thrilling Tales is going to do more for you than Mika's buff will. You can use her, like, heck, I've used her on a Hu Tao team for some melts and stuff. But she's so good with Farina. You've used her with Neuvillette. I've used her as an on-fielder for Hyperfridge. Just using her with Farina is so good. And any time that Krat was even remotely useful and you're using Farina, if you can squeeze her onto those teams, she's amazing. Even if you just have C0 and you just have to use Favonius Codex, Favav is still a very valuable weapon. Oh yeah, Mono Cryo. She gives Layla a run for her money on Mono Cryo because you're getting so much cryo particles anyways. You still need ER Sands, you still need as many ER substats as you can muster, but if you can get Thrilling Tales on her, now she's a great buffer as well as being a great healer. So yeah, I'm actually a huge fan of Charlotte. Plus their animations are some of the best in the game. So big Charlotte fan. Next is gonna be Ganyu. This was probably my most contested placement in my last tier list. And it's going to be one of my most contested placement again. Guys, I don't think Ganyu's that great. I think her melt teams are solid. Now, don't get me wrong, I've seen some impressive clears. If you are a sweaty tryhard and you do her cancels and you have crazy hyper invested Ganyu and you play PC, right? Not mobile, not controller, you play PC. I do play controller on my PC. So yeah, if you want to go ahead and say that, oh, he doesn't like Ganyu because he's on controller, that very well could be. I've seen some impressive clears that absolutely warrant a tier 1 placement, but these clears often are from, don't lie to me, they resulting from a whole lot of resetting. They require an absolutely mind-boggling amount of ER on your Xiangling team. They require Zhongli. Zhongli's shield is often not enough to block really heavy attacks from enemies lately if you're standing in Bennett's Circle because you're applied with Pyro. Some of these enemies are melting. Some of them are burning you. Some of them are aggravating, or not aggravating, but they're vaporizing you. Sometimes your shield gets broken and now you're just standing there like, what am I doing? You're charging your shot with your Ganyu. And her freeze teams are not very good most of the time. I still think she's good. I still think she's very good. This is a very good tier, but she does not, I'm being very choosy with who goes in the excellent and broken tier, and Ganyu for me just doesn't make it there. But again, if you play perfectly, if you do your resets, I definitely think tier 1 is possible. But I think for the majority of the players, without massive hyper investment especially, tier 2 is more than fair. Next, receiving a pretty big demotion is Kirara. I think Kirara is great Dendro applicator. Actually one of the better buffers for aggravate teams, being the defensive option with Sapwood Blade, Instructor's Artifact set. Really good character. Really good in Nilou Bloom teams. Still a really good character. I'm just kind of changing how I value them. I think again the floor has risen and she has not risen with it, but I think she's still very good. But the difference between a character like this and a character like Baizhu is much more apparent than it used to be. And similar thing with Yao Yao. I do think Yao Yao is the slightly better character. She does at least have some synergy with Farina, but similar to Sayu, she does need to spend a decent amount of time on field healing up your enemies or your allies. Not as much, right? She's not an on-field character, but overall, she doesn't do enough off-field healing to really be that solo healer. Still a great unit, still good on Nilou teams, still good on aggravate teams, still can buff your team, but not insane. I'm moving down Ayato a lot from my last tier list, unfortunately. I still think he's a great pull as like a role consolidating Hydro unit. He has some off-field presence, he has an on-field presence. Everything I said about him in my Ayato guide stands. He's a very flexible character, jack of all trades, master of none. Unfortunately in Genshin, most people get a lot of characters. You're going to be getting Yulan, and you're probably going to be getting Farina, you're probably going to be getting a lot of, maybe a Neuvillette. You're going to be getting lots of Hydro characters. You might struggle, once you do get those Hydro characters, you might struggle to find a place place for your Ayato. If you don't like any of those Hydro characters, or if you just love Ayato, he's an amazing pickup because he can fill so many roles. He can squeeze and work in every abyss. You can 36-star any abyss with him because he works in Freeze, he works in Burgeon, he works in Hyper Bloom, he works in Nilou. But he's never, or he's very, very rarely the best option. But I think people who love Ayato, you should be happy because he works in so many teams and you can just hyper invest into him and use him everywhere. Right? He's not like a character that you can only use on one team. He's a character that works everywhere. Easy to play, very fun, lots of pros. Just in terms of power, he doesn't hit excellent. He's a tier 2 character. Massive glow up coming to Noelle. She's probably the best on-fielder healing character, aside from Kokomi, I guess, because she actually does some damage and she's very comfy to play on field. You can either use her with triple Hydro, with double Hydro Kazuha, with just Farina, Albedo, Goro, with double Hydro Goro. All of these are going to be good. My Noelle is well invested, but not hyper invested. So well invested didn't cut it. I just want you to know she's not a character that you lightly invest and she reaches these peaks. You actually have to have C6. You have to actually invest in her. Otherwise, she will feel somewhat disappointing, probably, if you're expecting her to be cracked at low investment. It's not like Charlotte, where you barely need any investment in Charlotte to make her really pop off. Noelle needs a fair bit. But still, once you do get her there, her teams perform awesome. I don't think she belongs in tier 1. I know some people do. I think that's just because there aren't that many team-wide healers that we have right now, but the fact they have to use her as an on-field team-wide healer just restricts you of so many better on-fielder characters than using an off-field healer like Baizhu or Jean or some future healer character. Beidou is a great character. She's a little bit niche because her big damage only comes when there's 2, maybe 3 enemies on the field. As soon as you're in very large AoE or in single target, her damage kind of falls off a cliff. Better in AoE than a single target for sure. Her aggravate team is very good, and you can use her as a more defensive option for Neuvillette teams, and she's really, really strong. If she did good single target damage, I would put her in tier 1, 100%. I don't think Taser is okay, but it's not insane. If you want to learn more about Beidou, I made a great guide on her. I think she's one of the biggest 4 team slot syndrome characters. Like, often you'd want to use Beidou, but she'd work better as a 5th slot character, and she often gets pushed out. But still really strong, still really like her. Thoma is still pretty much the only character that's really used for Burgeon. Please also uses for Burgeon, and can be better, but Thoma's resistance to interruption is really, really nice, and being an off-field power applicator gives the teams more flexibility. Burgeon teams just aren't insane though. We kind of need like a dedicated Burgeon support of some kind to really take them to that insane level. But, you know, top of tier 2, he's still great. You can check out my Thoma guide if you want to learn more. At the very bottom of tier 1, I'm going to put Cyno. There's no question about it that Cyno's teams are powerful. And he is flexible. He has Hyper Bloom. He has Quicken. He has Quick Bloom. He can use Farina. He can use Yelan. He can use Zhongli. He can use Baizhu. But he's probably the most replaceable unit in this role. If I was considering value, if this was like a value tier list, there's no way he would be in tier 1 because he has very low account value, but his teams are strong. There's a lot of damage. Venti is a really weird character. His grouping is really strong, but sometimes it just does nothing, and he just has like VV and a tiny bit of energy regeneration, which if that was all he had and didn't have grouping, he would be here or here. Probably here. But his grouping is very good, but he doesn't trivialize content. He doesn't make content insane. I kind of would consider putting him here, but I still think he's good. If you play him with Farina, you can now build him attack, damage, crit instead of EM and get a lot more damage out of them that way. If you're building him with Wanderer, you can do the same sort of thing, and Faruzan. I definitely wouldn't put him higher than this, but I think this is okay. Zhongli had a very real chance of going down to tier 2, but he still has, especially with Farina coming out, but he still has he's very strong on Lyney teams, on C0 Neuvillette teams, and on Navia teams. So if those characters didn't really want the resistance interruption and the res shred that he gives, he would very easily go down to tier 2, but with the new characters coming out actually really liking him, he still keeps his tier 1 placement. I could see characters coming out that push him down to tier 2, just like Venti, but I still think he belongs here, on top of course, being a casual hero, mobile player hero. I think a lot of people really, really like just feeling invincible, feeling that interruption resistance, and they're releasing less. It's very infrequent for an on-field character to have fully uncounterable interruption resistance, so Zhongli still ends up being very valuable a lot of the time for a lot of players. Wriothesley, our newest addition to the Cryo family. Similar to Cyno, He's got good teams. Often the teams, like they use Farina, often these teams will be, you know, not quite as good as other teams. I still prefer Ayaka, but I'll admit my Ayaka is better invested than my Wriothesley, but I definitely think that they belong in the same tier. I think Wriothesley's very strong. I think he has some nice pros, is that his damage is infusion based instead of burst based, so that you have a lot more flexibility in rotations, finishing off enemies. He can be easier to play. I don't think he has any teams that are like super insane, and that's what keeps him being held back from being higher, but I still think his teams are very good, and he does a lot of damage on those teams. Klee is a character that's very underrated very often, and actually got a pretty sizable buff from Farina. Farina will vape her hits on the Klee team. She is pretty much a worse Lyney, so if you look at characters less in a vacuum and more in terms of relative to other characters, I could see you putting her in tier 2. I also don't like the way she plays. I don't find her fun or engaging. I find her clunky and annoying to play, but I have gotten some really good clears with her. Her clear times have impressed me, so I don't recommend picking her up for power at all, but if you like her, you can make her work. She's really, really strong. What can I say about Yae Miko? Her aggravate teams are amazing. She works great in Alhaitham spread, Tainari spread. You can use her as a flex pick for like Navia teams, or you can use her on Taser. You can use her with Raiden. You can use her with Farina. You can use her as like a Cyno replacement. I like her a lot. I think she's great. I think she's sort of held back by her normal attacks not being that fun to play and her animation time being really long. And I know a lot of people just don't like the way she plays, but I do. I think she's really fun to play. I think that once you get used to her skills, you can use them to dodge enemies, and she's not that bad to play for me. And whether you're using it as an on-fielder or dual DPS with Alhaitham or like a driver for official, definitely a tier 1 character. Shenhe, I keep loving Shenhe. I love her with Ayaka. The front load that she gives to Ayaka is critical in these trying times where bosses have invulnerability phases, you have shorter DPS windows. Being able to front load more of your Ayaka's burst damage, very, very valuable, especially the more you invest into your Ayaka. And she doesn't just work with Ayaka, obviously. You can use her to carry someone like Rosari or Kai or Chang'un. She works with Wriothesley, maybe not on his very best teams, but my favorite Wriothesley teams use Shenhe. I don't necessarily think she's like a super good pull for most players. Ayaka, one of my favorite DPSs to play. I think obviously she works great in freeze, she works great in AoE, but I think she's really, really underrated for bossing. To this day, she's one of my favorite characters to use in boss chambers. I love Mono Cryo. I almost like Mono Cryo more than I do her freeze teams. I almost like her for bossing more than I do for AoE chambers, because AoE chambers have a lot of junk and annoying stuff for grouping. Her front load is crazy. She does so much damage in such a short window. The caveat is that she does have to be very well invested in. Fortunately, Finale of the Deep is a great free-to-play option that is much closer to her signature than Amenoma was, but you do have to have good artifacts. If you don't have good artifacts, and I think a lot of people don't, then she could be even tier 2. So a lot of people flame me for overrating Ayaka. I don't think so, but yeah, she does need good artifacts and she does need good teams, and that's why she's not higher on the tier 1 list, right? That's why she's comparatively lower than a lot of other characters are going to be. Next is Child. I do think very highly of Child. I did move him down a fair bit from where I rated him before, and that's just because the crazy clears that you see, the speedrun level clears, they're pretty hard to do. They require high investment, high skill, and often a lot of resets and RNG. I do think he's really good. I think he's a top tier, excellent DPS, but I think it's kind of hard to pull off for maybe not the average player, but even the above average player, the good player, the hardcore masher. That's kind of how I describe myself. Is I'm a masher at heart, but I take the game seriously, and his stuff is hard to do. But if you really know what you're doing, you can push Child to the top of tier 1 for sure. For sure. Probably gonna get a lot of hate for this. This is where I'm putting Kokomi. I think Kokomi is very good. I think Hydro is a great element. I think being a team-wide healer is good. I think she'd be a lot better if she was a bigger team-wide healer from off-field, because basically to work properly with Farina, she has to be on-field, and on-field, Triple Hydro is awesome. It's a great team. It's a very comfortable team, very fun, does a lot of damage. It's not my favorite double Hydro team, but it's nice that it has that grouping. I like it better than Taser for sure, and she does a lot of personal damage on that team, which is awesome. She still works amazingly with Nilou, amazing, best in slot with Ayaka. If you want to put her closer to the top of tier 1, I could definitely see that. But I think there's just so many Hydro characters these days, and oftentimes your healer slot is better off to be a different element. It's better off being Jean, or it's better off being someone else. If you have a Nilou healer, so often you're going to be using a shielder. I think a lot of the best teams these days just don't use Kokomi and don't fit Kokomi. I think similar to Ayato, she's very flexible. You can use her in Hyper Bloom, you can use her in Vaporize, you can use her in Freeze, you can use her in all this stuff, but where is her actual power level? I think it's right here. Still excellent, still really good, but I know some people truly think she's a broken character, and I just don't think she brings the offense to be a broken character. Like, Bennett heals, and he heals enough to actually work with Furina, but he also gives a massive attack buff. Kokomi can give Thrilling Tales, but then she's foregoing a lot of ER or a lot of personal damage. You know, Kuki heals, not enough to work with Furina, but if you use, you know, Prototype Amber on someone else, then it is enough with Furina. And she procs Hyper Blooms, which do a ton of damage. Kokomi, yes, she provides Hydro Application healing, but it's not enough to put her into broken tier for me. Navia, one of the brand new characters. People are going to be saying that I'm overhyping her. People really underestimate her front load. The ability to front load her damage and to cheat out future rotations damage into her first rotation by having a 3 skills in rotation is insane. Not only does it make her clears more consistent, it makes them a lot faster. Her being Geo is not a downside because she doesn't have to be in mono Geo. If you need Hydro, you can run double Hydro with her. If you need Electro, you can run Fischl with her, or Yae Miko. She is not tied to elements. She's not tied to certain characters. Her best teams obviously include Bennett and usually Zhongli or Albedo. But her teams are very flexible in that they can run other characters if those are going to be better for that Abyss. The front load is insane. I wouldn't be surprised if she continued to be pushed higher with future character releases. My hot take was that by the time next year rolls around, like a whole year from now, there will have been other Geo characters and supports and other synergistic characters that make her one of the top DPSs. She's going to be at the top of tier 1. Maybe not the very best DPS, but closer to the top. But I think right now she's already here. She does require high investment. She does require good artifacts. The higher investment you can push, the better, because her damage is raw stats, but that's okay. Speaking of raw stats and high investment, Wanderer is going to be next. Wanderer is a character that I didn't like all that much previously. I had him at the bottom of this tier, but I have since seen the light and I began using him without shielders on the team and just another DPS, and then use Bennett as the healer, and I am much happier with his damage output. Yes, there's some quality of life, issues with being knocked around and stuff. Gotta get good in dodge. Staying in Bennett circles annoying. I love him with Charlotte. Charlotte, Furina, and Farazan is like chef's kiss, because especially if you can get Thrilling Tales on Charlotte, because that freeze is so nice so that you can reduce that stagger, not being tied to Bennett's circle, tons of damage. But using Giga Buffed Wanderer with Bennett and Farazan C6 and Furina, amazing. Farazan is probably the main character we think of when we think of unrealistic C6s to get, because let's be honest, going back through this list, like most of the C6s don't matter that much, and even if they do, a lot of them you can like buy them from the shop. Like Noelle, yeah, I need her C6, but if you really want it, you can buy it from the shop, and she would go down like not that much in tiers. Like Mika still stands on his own with his healing for Furina teams. He would only go down related to Eula, but like these 4 stars don't need their constellations. Yeah, Charlotte wants her C4, but doesn't like change tiers if she goes down. Farazan is a character that goes down to tier 2 or probably realistically tier 3 without her C6. With her C6, she's definitely tier 1. If you are, or I guess I should be putting Xiao before her. Xiao is obviously not a character that I have. He hasn't rerun in a long time. I think the consensus is that he's a bit worse than Wanderer, but I think there might be something coming soon that might change that. But his AoE, he's basically Wanderer, but he has better AoE. But Wanderer even has okay AoE with his charge attacks, so I'm not sure. If any of you guys have both, let me know. They're both hyper carry Anemo DPSs who want C6 Farazan. I think they're pretty darn comparable. I'm really excited to get him. I think his playstyle is super cool. A big part of his damage comes from hitting collision plunges, so you get double, like a bit of extra damage or quite a bit of extra damage damage from hitting the plunge twice if you are on a big body enemy. So, and running him without a shielder increases his damage by a lot, but it's much harder to do, similar to Wanderer. So I think they both have, you know, their pros and cons and their difficulties, and I'm just putting all three of these characters right here because obviously both of them benefit hugely from C6 Farazan, who just gives energy, crowd control, resistance shred, crit damage. She's insane, but she does require C6. I will say this: if you're a die-hard Wanderer or Xiao main, you want a gun for Farazan C6. Eventually, you just have to suck it up. You just have to do it. Yeah, there's RNG. Yeah, it may take you tons of wishes, but may take you years to get it, but you want to do it. And I'm sorry it has to be this way. It sucks that you can't ever absolutely guarantee it, but her C6 is really damn good. And if that deters you, then you probably shouldn't go for these characters, because these characters are hyper carry, so they do require good investment. Like hyper carry DPSs require good investment. You're gonna have, and then you're playing a bit of an RNG game. You need eventually just to roll the dice on artifacts, get good artifacts. You're gonna need to roll the dice on C6 Farazan. You're gonna need to get good artifacts. That's the case for a lot of these characters. The only teams that really don't rely on that are like Hyper Bloom teams and Nilou teams. So, but if you actually, you know, want to do proper damage with these characters, you do need good artifact investment, and that's RNG, and that sucks, but it is what it is. Sucrose is probably the biggest fall from grace on this list, and I'm actually going to put her all the way back here. I know a lot of people are not going to like this placement at all, but I don't like Sucrose. I don't think her grouping is very good at all. I think that the teams that you actually want to use her on, that she's best in slot in, are very few and far between. I think she's still a fantastic character. This is an excellent tier, but I don't think she's a god tier broken unit. I think the reason why Kazuya is as good as he is in large part because of the grouping, and I just don't think that Sucrose's grouping is very consistent. I think that the amount of enemy AI manipulation you have to do to really get Sucrose cooking, you honestly may as well not run a grouper at all. I've found that that instead of choosing Sucrose for a team, I'll just choose, you know, say I'm playing Raiden double Hydro Gene and I want to use that on an AoE side, or even Hu Tao double Hydro Gene, rather than trying to slot in Sucrose or run it like not slot in that team, but use a team with Sucrose. I would just rather to manipulate the enemy's AI, so I don't need a grouper at all. And when I do need grouping, I'd rather just bring Venti or Kazuha. So yeah, if you don't have Venti or Kazuha, then yeah, right, Sucrose is going to be great. And I think that Sucrose is better with Farina because she gives the EM and you get the damage buff from Farina. So if you're using like a freeze team with Sucrose, yeah, she's a much better budget option. Like, I think that's a pretty underrated part of Sucrose, but I still never ever use her. Never. And I think that Anemo is much less required than it used to be. You don't need Anemo on both sides anymore with the amount of other types of teams there are, with spread, with double Hydro, or if you do need Anemo on the other side, you're going to use Gene or something. I still think, now here's for the positive parts, right? The EM buff is still really good. The C6 in Aggravate is still really good. Using her as an on-fielder in Aggravate with Beidou, still really good, but it's not so good that it's not a broken team. It's just a very good team. But if you look at pretty much all the top characters, pretty much none of them use Sucrose as their favorite option. Fischl, very excellent character, but I'm actually going to move her down here. I think she's here's the thing, she's a very valuable character. And same with Sucrose. Like, if you want to build a team for the Abyss, Aggravate is one of the best teams you can build because you get Fischl for free. Sucrose is a 4-star. You get Beidou for free. You get Lisa for free. You get Kaching. So like you run your Lisa, Fischl, Yao Yao you get for free, and Sucrose, and you've got an amazingly valuable free-to-play Aggravate team that can carry you through any Abyss ever. But it's not a top tier team. It's nowhere near as good as all the top teams. Fischl has just been pushed out of the meta despite getting huge buffs, despite being more powerful than ever. Other teams are just better. I could see her being above Ayaka. I could see, if you want to say this, I could see her, but I still prefer Ayaka Shenhe, but she's more valuable than those characters. She's more valuable than most of these characters. I would recommend most people build a Fischl because most people are not going to get most or all of these characters, but she's not one of the top picks like she used to be. Next is Lyney. I think Lyney's awesome. He's not my style because charge shot bows. I'm a controller player, but that doesn't change the fact that he slaps hard. And if you really hyper invest into him, like he competes potentially even above Hu Tao. And because I'm basically going to put Hu Tao right up next to him. I personally still think Hu Tao is better. I like Hu Tao better, but Lyney is an amazing DPS. I think my biggest dislike for him is his team typing restrictions. He really wants monopyro, but even that was kind of solved by Furina because you can actually run Furina and reverse vape Furina on him and still keep pretty good uptime on his passive. It's just a very squishy and somewhat impractical team. That's my least favorite thing about him is I get knocked around so much. I'm in the middle of charging at my charge shot and I get knocked around. With high investment, you can afford to run a Zhongli, which is great. And if you learn how to cancel his charge shots, etc., and get faster stuff, he can be even better. But I'm gonna put him here. He's not for the faint of heart though. Make sure you enjoy his playstyle before you pull him. I personally get faster clears with Navia because she's easier, but he's still very good. Next is Hu Tao. Hu Tao always amazes me. Just patch after patch after patch. She's like the new Xiangling. She just keeps winning, like with new battle pass bows, with hydro resonance, with double hydro, now with Furina, and there might be things in the future that improve her even more. Hu Tao with Furina, Yelan, and Jean is insane. It's in the top 3 Furina teams for me, I think. Maybe top 4, which I mean checks out with this placement, right? She's one of the best DPSs, even being one of the very first DPSs in the game, and still one of the best. Amazing, very impressive. If you get her signature weapon, you could start to put her even higher. She might not even need her C1 in the future, depending on what else happens. So very excited for the current state of Hu Tao, very excited for the future. Some people don't like her playstyle though, similar to Lyney. I love her playstyle, doesn't bother me, but some people don't like her jump cancels, dash cancels, etc. They just like to mash. Not the character for you. She is a bit technical, but I like it personally. But yeah, some people don't, so you know, don't get her just for power, but she is awesome. I'm actually gonna put Xiangling just behind these 3. Well, it's tough. If you're low investment for your Hu Tao and Lyney, then I'd put Xiangling above. If you're getting a high investment, then she starts to go below. She's again a very valuable character, but there's less and less teams that are using her optimally, mostly because of Furina existing. That doesn't make Xiangling worse though, so I don't know. Off-field pyro application, still the only off-field pyro applicator. Actually, I'll put her ahead. The only off-field pyro applicator to this day. No ICD on her burst, insane scaling, not quite as good damage as Lyney and Hu Tao in single target, but insane AoE, and even against bosses, her burst hits multiple times against really big enemies, so sometimes she even does just as much. So amazing character, very free to play friendly. You get her for free. Xiangling, goated. Baizhu, what a character. His on-field hyperbloom stuff is insane, just almost as good as Nahida, like really close, while being a healer, while working with Furina. Amazing with Neuvillette, amazing in aggravate, amazing in hyperbloom. Baiju's so good. Simple, right? He heals, provides Dendro, provides some interruption resistance. That interruption resistance is very nice, even though it's not permanent and consistent. Even when it breaks, it comes back, so you actually might get, especially against really aggressive enemies, you may get more value out of his interruption resistance than out of Zhongli. Plus, if you do get hit, he heals. Not only a comfort pick, but also because of his huge off-field healing, he's often a damage gain when you're using Furina. And I think sky's the limit. I think he's gonna get better. I think this character has to be the biggest glow up of all time. Jean is now unironically a top tier character, and that's just insane to me. As I was putting this tier list together, like I was gonna put her in tier 2 because previously she's in tier 3, but I was like, heck no. Jean is an insane character. She's part of most of Furina's best teams. Hu Tao double hydra with Jean, Raiden double hydra with Jean. They're so good. They're so good. Neuvillette with Jean. Like Jean plus Furina, getting the VV shred plus the healing with Furina's buffs is crazy value for those 2 character slots. It's better for single target, of course, but even in AoE, as I said before, if you learn how to manipulate enemy AI, oftentimes Jean's swirl is big enough to hit all the enemies because her burst is very large, and Furina has a little bit of AoE on some of her stuff, but just the damage output is so high that often you're able to get away with these teams even in AoE, but it really is more of a single target team. Still, she doesn't touch the likes of Kazuha, right? Grouping is just such a broken mechanic. Being able to move the enemies and stagger them towards you is just such a broken mechanic and ability that so few characters have. Even though Jean doesn't have it, she still does a lot. She's solid. I underrated her in my last tier list. I actually think she's probably a tier 2 character. Her shield breaking potential, her big heals, her sunfire abilities, but really it's her synergy with Furina that puts her at the top, close to the top of tier 1 for me. Bit of a fall. Nilou is still one of my favorite characters to use, but I think that in Sumeru, there were definitely a lot more Nilou abysses, and I definitely overestimated her a little bit because of how many Nilou tailored abysses there were. Lately, there haven't been as many, and you can see there have been a lot more Neuvillette tailored abysses, and now he's seeming like far and away the S tier DPS, and so I'll concede that she is an amazing character, but not the top broken character that she once was. In terms of value, in terms of, you know, output per investment, she's incredible. Not even, you know, you can give her a level 1 dull blade and she slaps the abyss. I think people really underrate her team flexibility. Like, yes, she can't have a lot of elemental flexibility, but the amount of Dendro and Hydro characters that there are and that she can work with gives her a lot of flexibility, and she can work versus single target. You can put Furina on her teams, you can put Xingqiu or Yelan on her teams, and lots of people scoff at me, but it works really well. You can either put some EM on them for a sort of hybrid build. If you get her the key, even better, but I don't even have the key. I have a level 40 Dockhand. I haven't even leveled it up properly. With the new artifact set, you can get closer to her HP cap, so she can run 4-piece HP now. Insane character. I'm not sure if I want to put Kuki or Raiden next. I'm going to try and keep it as objective as possible. I think Raiden is next. I love Raiden. Raiden is my favorite DPS in the game. It's mostly because of her unlimited resistance to interruption, her energy regeneration, her front load, and her high flexibility. All that together just makes her my favorite. She works incredibly well with Furina, Yelan, and Jean, like incredibly well. It's not as high of DPS as Hu Tao, but it is much more comfortable, much more easier to play, much more mashy friendly. One of the few characters in the entire game that's a DPS and that has infinite interruption resistance. As the more aggressive enemies come into the abyss, this is a very, very valuable trait, and I think it makes her one of the best DPSs. I probably wouldn't be able to justify putting her all the way up here just on her DPS potential alone, however. She would probably be more here, maybe here, maybe here, but because she also has access to Hyper Bloom with Neuvillette, Hyper Bloom with Alhaitham, Hyper Bloom with Nahida, that cements her as a top tier character, but at the top of tier 1. The fact that she has both of those builds is very, very impressive. The reason why I put Kuki just above her is because I do think that healer role consolidation is very, very valuable, especially with Furina out now. Yes, the healing of her skill alone isn't enough to max Furina stacks, but by putting Prototype Amber on Nahida or someone else on the team, it brings it up to par. And being able to be a healer and Hyper Bloom trigger is incredible. Raiden as a Hyper Bloom technically has more power. You know what? I'm going to put Raiden above her because Raiden's skill also buffs the elemental bursts of the characters, and she has all that flexibility as a DPS as well. I'm going to put her above, but it's really tough. You know, and some people don't like Hyper Bloom as much. Some people who are more Dolphins or very, very high investment, they don't like Hyper Bloom as much. They would put Hyper Bloom below some of these other characters. They below Wanderer, right? As soon as you start Dolphining on Wanderer, he starts being better. As soon as you start C1R1 Hu Tao, as soon as you start, you know, C1R1 Lyney, these characters start creeping above Hyper Bloom. But if you go for C2 Raiden, then we're also Dolphining as well. So there's more vertical investment with Raiden than with Kuki. And of course, Nilou with the key, that's a whole thing. That's why we're just mostly sticking to C0, R0, because otherwise there's just there's way too much to consider. Alhaitham is next. So close to the S tier, but even though I still don't have him in the tier 0, he's still moved up above a lot of the other characters that I had below. I underestimate Alhaitham. He does a ton of damage. His spread teams are really where I really underestimate him. They're really good. Even with a character like Lisa, even when I haven't properly optimized my Yae Miko rotations, Alhaitham does very, very impressive damage. One of the best carries in the game. Great flexibility, great damage, free to play friendly. He does require Nahida. I'd say he's also a very low account value pull because you might as well just get more copies of Nahida or Furina or something like that. or just get them in general and get some different characters. But in terms of power, yeah, Alhaitham's got power. His teams are really, really good. I know everyone's been waiting for it. Is Neuvillette tier 0 broken, or is he top of tier 1? I personally believe that at Constellation 0, with a free-to-play weapon or with Battle Pass weapon, like an R1 Battle Pass weapon, I think he's just tier 1. Just the very best tier 1 character. I think he's the very best character, very best carry in the game, very best on-fielder. Huge flexibility, huge damage, very easy to play. The things that keep him out of tier 0 for me are how much his damage suffers without his signature weapon. If you were to give him his signature weapon, I think tier 0. If you were to give him his Constellation 1, I think tier 0, because his other issue for me is his lack of interruption resistance. It hurts so much to suck up all of your bulbs and then be staggered out, instantly lose all the damage from that charge attack. It's a freaking pain, and it doesn't always happen. Yeah, you can kite and you can move around and you can dodge, but you can't always. And when you get knocked out of that, it sucks. With his C1, that's fixed. But if we start giving him C1 or R1, then we have to start having to talk about, you know, a R1 weapon or a C1. What about Hu Tao's C1? You know, what about Wanderer? I do think he gets the most value out of his C1 R1 out of any character. So maybe Raiden still doesn't make tier 0 if she has her C2. That's a video for another day. Same with Hu Tao, but Neuvillette definitely would. So you can see that I have an appreciation for Neuvillette above the other carries in the game. The fact that he's Hydro means that he can be your Hydro pick for your account. Like, you can run him on Hyper Bloom and not have to get Yelan, not have to get Farina, right? It's not like he needs Farina to be broken. He's broken all on his own. Yeah, if you want to use, you know, carry Neuvillette with Kazuha, Zhongli, and Farina, yeah, you kind of need Farina for that. Like, Fischl's good, but kind of suspect. Speaking of Fischl, maybe she belongs more here. I don't know. But the fact that he can switch out, that he's not locked into the whole rotation, you can refresh VV, refresh your other skills, such flexible rotations, so easy and fun to play. Yeah, Neuvillette, incredible. Now, the top 6 characters in the game. Obviously, the only character unrated is Farina. Where does she show up? Who is number 6? People are gonna be mad. It's Xingqiu. Yeah, a lot of people vehemently call Xingqiu the very best character in the entire game. He's still incredible, absolutely, but he's not the ceiling damage on any team anymore, I don't think. After Farina's release, yeah, he's not the ceiling damage. Now, for comfort, he does have a lot of comfort, and he's really underrated. For 40% damage reduction is massive. So if you're dying, like sometimes I've been dying and I've been using Yelan and I switch for Xingqiu and I stop dying against like Capellia, but sometimes I just play better and, you know, and then just win. He's still an insane character. He's not then this is where the idea of, you know, characters in a vacuum versus characters relative to other characters, I take a mix of both, right? Just because he's not best in slot on any team doesn't mean he's not tier 4. He's still tier 0 broken. It's just that he's not as broken as some of the other characters. The amount of damage he does, Hydro application, interruption resistance, damage reduction. The interruption resistance is sort of a bait, in my opinion. Very few characters, except for maybe Hu Tao, really benefit from that particular amount of interruption resistance. A lot of characters who are gonna get staggered are still gonna get staggered anyways. And the Hydro application really doesn't matter. Like, little known fact, like Raiden National with Yelan is just better than Xingqiu. Like, sure, sometimes the damage you take with Raiden is gonna matter, but for the most part it doesn't, in my opinion. And you're just better off having more damage from Yelan. It's like, oh, but she doesn't provide as much Hydro. Kind of bait. More damage is almost always better, and her Hydro application is generally more than enough. Next character is Bennett. A lot of people were saying that with Farina, like, his healing wouldn't be enough, but his attack buff is just so huge that it's almost always worth it to just make him heal more. Just put more healing artifacts on him. You lose a bit of buff up time in exchange for healing your team, but he heals really fast and really big ticks. So yeah, you might need to change up his build a little bit, but he's still insane. The attack buff, the amount of characters that he still works with, it's not as many. Like, if you look at the top tier DPSs, Neuvillette doesn't use Bennett, Alhaitham doesn't use Bennett, Raiden doesn't always use Bennett. We kind of have to go all the way to Xiangling. But the thing is, right, when you hyper invest into Lyney, Wanderer, Xiao, Navia, as child, Flea, most, like a good chunk of the characters still do use Bennett. Like a good chunk of the top tier teams still use him, just maybe not the tippy top. What if Bennett is a tier 1? No, we're not going to think about that today. I'm going to stick to my guns, especially since he's just so irreplaceable. That's the thing about his teams, is that one thing I do want to say as well is the power gap difference between these teams in tier 1 and even in tier 2, no, in tier 1 and even the top half of tier 2, we'll say, is much smaller than you think in actual practice. And Bennett is just so irreplaceable on the teams that you use him in that I think that still puts him in the broken tier for sure. Kazuha, as I was saying, crowd control is just such a fundamentally broken ability, and really no one does it to the same degree as Kazuha. Venti does it a little, like, better in some ways and worse in others, but the fact that Kazuha also buffs, also resistance shreds, and there's just, again, similar to Bennett, there's no replacement for the crowd control that Kazuha gives, and just makes him a broken tier 0 character, plus the buffing and debuffing. And now that you can see our top 3, I'm going to spoil it. These are the top 3 characters, but starting with Nahida, Dendro, the second best element in the game probably, and Nahida's kit being just ridiculous. She does a ton of damage, a good amount of, like, not a ton of damage, a good amount of damage, a good amount of buffing, a ton of Dendro application, and the reality is she's just part of most characters' best teams at C0. Neuvillette, Alhaitham, Farina, Yelan, not Kazuha, not Bennett, but Xingqiu yes, Raiden yes, Kuki yes, Nilou yes, right? She's just a ton of characters, part of a ton of characters' best teams, and no one can do what she does. No one has off-field Dendro application as much as Nahida does, and that's just what makes her so broken. Number 2 is Yelan. I already kind of talked about it when I talked about Xingqiu, but the superior damage plus the buffing plus still having enough hydro application for as long as you infuse, like, if you're using Hutao VV Vape or Yoimiya VV Vape, as long as you infuse Kazuha's burst with hydro, you have more than enough hydro to vape. You have more than enough hydro for quick bloom Alhaitham, which is, you know, and it's just better. It's just better damage. More than enough hydro for, you know, for Raiden National. And then of course the most broken team in the game, the most broken core, I think right now, is Yelan, Farina, and Jean, I think. Or Neuvillette, Farina, Jean. Or Neuvillette, Farina, Kazuha. It's the double Hydro plus Anemo. That's the most broken core. Or double Hydro plus Hyper Bloom. But really it's the double Hydro. And I think Yelan is just, I could see making the argument that Neuvillette is just an on-field version of Yelan. But I think that for me, the fact that Yelan is off-field, allowing me to run another DPS on field is insane. And the fact that Yelan, here's what really pushes her over the top, is that Farina's buff applies to all characters, so the on-field character, but also the off-field characters. So that means Yelan's personal damage, which was already higher than Xingqiu, is now even higher. Her personal damage just becomes absurd. And if you can, and her energy requirements are reduced, so you can run her with a 5-star weapon, or just with slingshot, or with the stringless, or with some other weapon that is more damage focused, then her damage is pushed even higher. Of course, you don't want to use stringless because you already get so much damage bonus from Farina, but also Yelan buffs the on-field character, so that's even more broken. And then of course Farina. I still see people not really getting Farina. Yes, you need to run a healer, but people understand her buff is an entire character all on its own. Like, just the buff is strong enough for entire character, and just her off-field damage is strong enough for entire character. So it's like she's role consolidating 2 characters into one, and broken characters, I might add, like really broken characters. But she requires another character to make it work. So she's deconsolidating a role as well. But if that healer can do other good stuff, so for example, if your healer can be Prototype Amber, Nahida, and Kuki, then all of a sudden you're not deconsolidating the roles as much. If that healer can be Jean, who's also VV shredding, if that healer can be Baizhu, who's also applying valuable Dendro, if that healer can be Bennett, who's also buffing, then Farina cheats, and that deconsolidation is less deconsolidated, and now you're just left with, basically she's 2 broken characters in one. Now, I'm not saying she's like twice as good as other characters, but she is, in my opinion, the very best character in the game. If you want further proof of that, watch my video, the best team for every elemental reaction, and just look at how many videos feature Furina. Leave your disagreements in the comments. Hopefully you actually watched the video and didn't just skip to the end. But even if you did, I still appreciate you. Bye for now.